I don't have to, right?
Correct.
Great. Okay. Hi. Well, isn't it funny how one person's tiny niche is kind of it looks from the distance so small, and then when you get into it, it's nice and large. And isn't it funny that Liz has known me for 40 years and nobody else does, really? And that's because the world of early music is kind of tiny. But in Washington, it got a foothold with the Folger Consort. That the way I heard about it, some guy named Christopher Kendall went into O.B. Hardison's office and said, "You need an early music group at the Folger Library, and we've got one for you." And then Christopher called his friends Bob and Scott and said, "Hey, we got a gig." And everybody moved to Washington and worked as waiters until they actually made some money. Well, this is, I'm talking like 1976 here. And I was in New York and I fell in love with this guy named Scott who said, "Move down to Washington and I'll start a group for you." And I said, "Yeah, I've heard that one before." But I did. And he started another group, a group that did what the Folger Consort didn't do. And it was called Hesperus. And after about a year of living on MacArthur Boulevard in a very noisy apartment, we moved to Arlington, which at the time, which was about 1979, nobody lived here, right? Has anybody else lived here that long since 1980? That, yeah. So I bought my house for $93,000, right? Because nobody wanted to live in Arlington because it was on the other side of the river. And we all know that you go to the other side of the river and you're in, the country. So, um, that was how we started living here, and it turned out to be a great neighborhood, convenient to everything, including to Capitol Hill and the Folger. When you had forgotten your music, it was 20 minutes until the concert started and you had to get there and back. So that was very useful to find out. But living in Washington and trying to be a musician here turned out to be a really good idea because Washington is full of people who did music in college, right? They were singers, they played in the college band, but when they're here, their jobs were too demanding to really do any music, but they still wanted to have some in their life. And so it was a great place to produce a group. People came to concerts, they gave money, they bought CDs, and at the time it was LPs. And so we were happy to develop the group here and did a fair amount of stuff. Both Scott and I were in Folger for the next 20 years. I was a frequent guest artist, which basically meant that I had no say in what went on, but I still had to go all the rehearsals. And Scott was a member. But Hesperus kept doing pretty well. We ended up an ensemble in residence at the Smithsonian at American History during the time that of the Columbus Quincentenary, wait, 1992, at which time everyone was jonesing for music from the time of Columbus in Latin America, and we were the group that had the recording. So that was what put Hesperus on the map. 1992, all of a sudden, we had 60 touring concerts, and somebody picked us up and we got management. And so that was a career. We had two local series, one at the Corcoran and one at Georgetown. We were an ensemble in residence at Georgetown University. We're also in residence at the Smithsonian. We toured all around the world for the USIA. Now, that was great. It was a wonderful way to live, but Scott was bipolar. And I don't know if you know anybody with bipolar, but there's no real winning with bipolar. Bipolar pretty much takes over, and Scott left us in 2005. So in 2005, I had a choice, which was, do I keep running Hesperus, do all these great things, or do I actually do stuff for myself? Because there are things that I like to do. And so I decided that I was going to do a little bit of both. So just to detour for a second and tell you about what I do. Oh, by the way, questions are great. Just kind of either put them in the chat, or if there's something you want to hear me talk about, just wave your hand and I'll see you. By the way, I'm happy to talk to screens that only have people's names on it, but I'm even happier if you show me your face. I like talking to people. I'm not really good with signs. Anyway, Thank you. I appreciate that. Anyway, so what I do is I'm a string jock. I like things with bows and strings. I got curious about viola da gamba in high school, and at college I went to Oberlin, which at the time just had a few instruments. I'll show you what it looks like. Oh, okay. So this is the viola da gamba. It comes in three different sizes. Well, four actually. This one is the bass. It's so big that it doesn't actually kind of fit in this, but you notice it looks like a cello, but when you look closely, it's not. It's got frets, it's got six strings, and they're tuned more like a guitar with fourths, and there's a third in the middle, and you hold your bow with the fingers on the hair, like that, for nuance and subtlety, so they say. So the viola da gamba is a great instrument. You can do all sorts of stuff with it. You can play one note, or you can play a bunch of notes, chords, right? You can play very low. It's a great bass instrument. That's a D. Or you can play high. So it's an alto instrument as well as a bass instrument. And you can even sing and play at the same time. And at this juncture, let's see, tobacco, tobacco, sing. I can't do it. Sweetly for tobacco. That's better. Tobacco is like love. Oh, love it. For you see, I shall prove it. So that's a song written by Tobias Hume, who obviously liked tobacco. But you see, it's a lovely instrument and very, very resonant. And it comes in three different sizes. This is bass, there's also tenor and treble. So I first started playing the viola da gamba, and then I thought, well, you know, I used to play the modern violin, but I'm not very good at it except for folk fiddle. And the earlier violin, looks like a violin, and if you look closer, you notice the strings are yellow. And that's because they're gut. They're made out of sheep gut. So this violin, there's a little wedge here. It's a little smaller than a modern violin. It's from the Renaissance. The prototype was from 1588. And you notice there's no chin rest or anything because people didn't use them. They balanced them on their shoulder. You know, you got two bones there. You balance it here, push in, and hope for the best. And it sounds pretty much out of tune. It sounds like a modern violin, a little scratchier, but I've gotten really used to that scratch. So there's that. But then I was trying to figure about the ancestors of the violin, and I found out about this instrument, which is different shape, huh? Round on the back, pear-shaped at the top, three strings. And it looks like, you know, a kind of earlyish violin. It also looks like the Indian rebab, which is played on the knee, actually. This is called the rebec, R-E-B-E-C, and it's played by angels. So there. And angels in the Middle Ages played the rebec, and when you play this, you can't put it here because it slides, because it's round on the back. So angels and I to stick it in their armpits, which works as long as you keep pushing in. So you have to push in as well as playing. And this sounds kind of like that. So it's you know, a nice instrument. Um, and it's important that you have the right instrument when you're playing music from about 400 years. Hey, excuse me a second, I gotta close the window. When you're playing music from that time period, you can't play, I mean, you can't play a violin in the Middle Ages. They didn't have them. It just doesn't work. So it's important to have timely instruments like this rebec. And then I thought, well, what about non-European instruments? There must be something that I could play. And this is what I got. And it looks like a lozenge, right? And it has a flat back. And this is a real one. It's called a pontic lira, or la lira pontica, or it's also called a quimanche. Well, quimanche is a word that kind of means generic fiddle. This particular one, someone found in a store in Greece. So it's from the Pontic Islands of Greece. It's also called a Black Sea fiddle. This is the folk version. The court version looks more like the rebec, actually, but you play it down. It has this little thing at the bottom. I heard somebody play one of these once, and he put it on his knee and it stayed there. I was trying to figure out how it stayed there. And afterwards, I asked him how he got the instrument so that it didn't move. And his friend translated, and then his friend listened back and said that the guy said Velcro. So he'd been using Velcro on his knee and put a little piece of Velcro on the bottom. And that made the quimanche stay there. What I do is I just hold it between my knees, and I'm sorry I can't show you, but you can imagine that underhand bow, and I say it sounds like a bad cough, you know. Right? Let's see, a song. This especially lends itself to big wide vibratos and pitch changing and stuff, because the scale that the instrument used isn't a piano scale. You can't really play this with a piano. Some of the notes are lower, some of the notes are higher. And that's the way the Middle Eastern scales are. Have you ever noticed that a lot of the notes sound a little flat or sharp to our ears? And they're not actually. Within their scales, they're perfect. We use a basic one that they call tempered, which means that everybody can play along with the piano and feel like they're in tune.
Amy, we've
So,
got a couple of questions if you want to pause for
yeah,
a second.
that's good, Bob.
First one is they wanted to know how many people were in the original Folger and Hesperus ensembles, and what instruments did they play?
Okay, well, the original Folger consort was the Antioch consort transposed. Scott Rice, my husband, Bob Eisenstein, and Christopher Kendall were the founders of the Folger consort, and they had all been at Antioch together. And actually, the word is that Scott was sitting under a tree the first day of classes at Antioch playing a recorder, and some guy walked by and said, I got one of those. And that was Bob. And so they became the Antioch consort, which was probably very interesting at the time. Um, and they were joined by a townie named Warren Luther, and that was the original Folger consort, those four guys. But I was a friend of Bob back in New York days, and Bob called me and said, okay, we're the Folger concert, the four of us, and we're going to do our inaugural concert. And we've never done a professional concert before, so will you come and play with us? So I was there for the first Folger concert. And they also had a singer, Anne Munoz, who was there for a while, but the group itself was the four guys. Warren gave up after a year and moved back to Antioch. But the three guys kept going, and usually supplemented it with a guest artist or two. And as for Hesperus, well, we first started out as doing what the Folger didn't do. And the Folger supposedly only did English Renaissance music. So we did both medieval and Baroque. And the first Hesperus was me and Scott and Bob Eisenstein playing Baroque. And we had a harpsichordist, Peter Marshall. But that changed because it turns out Folger Consort started doing all this other stuff too, and then we started expanding too. So the first functional Hesperus was myself, Scott, and Mark Sudek, who is director of the Peabody Early Music Program right now, also in Baltimore Consort. But he played cittern and lute with us. So this is all from a long time ago. Another question.
Did the Renaissance violin sound scratchy because of the gut strings? And if it did the modern violin with gut strings sound more like your demonstration, before they came along with the nylon strings?
Well, actually, people don't use nylon strings now. They use metal strings, or they'll maybe have a core of gut or nylon with metal wrapped around it. So as for straight nylon, nah, not professionals. Though I did once have a ukulele that had nylon strings, and it sounded very twangy. The thing about the gut is that it absorbs moisture from the air, but it absorbs it irregularly. That, to make a string, it's not just one piece of something, it's a filament in the middle, and then they start wrapping filaments of other things around that middle. So when you have a gut string, it's made of 10 wrappings of things, and they wrap it, then they oil it. But because it's made that way, when it starts absorbing moisture, which strings do, strings and hair absorb moisture in the yes the when they're out instead of in their cases, it'll absorb it irregularly, which makes the string not vibrate the same all the way up and down. And because of that, if you hit the bow, you're bowing here and then you bow here, you'll get a different sound. And it's way too easy to get a nasty sound. So people like me who play instruments with gut strings, we incorporate that into the style of playing. And I mean, you can't say that all of us are terrible players. I think that it has a lot to do with the instrument that we play. Viola da gamba, we practice very hard not to make nasty sounds, but then that instrument resonates more. And so we can depend on the instrument's resonance to cover some of the nastiness. It's an interesting challenge, that the orchestral sound that you hear, which is very smooth on a violin, smooth and lots of vibrato and very continuous and stuff, that is not the sound ideal in the instruments I play. We go for articulation and for shapes. And so we just incorporate whatever happens with the strings is one of the things that happens. So.
And what is the time period of the Rebec?
About the year 1100 to about the year 1450. Went a little bit longer as a folk instrument, but about 1450 the viol started being played, and about 1550 is when the violin started being played. So I guess you could say the Rebec went into the 16th century. I know that a lot of people just think of now and then and don't really think a whole lot about here we are in this century now, these 50 years do this and these. But for those of us who do early music, we study all those 50 years because, I mean, think back 50 years ago, which I can say here because we all can think back 50 years ago, but think how society was different, how people liked different things, how they did different things. Well, in the past, it was just as different. Maybe things changed a little more slowly because there wasn't as much media, if any, to communicate. Even so, there were many people who traveled and brought new ideas all sorts of places. So just like things changed then, things change now. Or just like things change now, things change then. And that's our job, which is to not play the Rebec in the year 1600 because it wasn't played anymore, for example.
The last question we've got is, what about horsehair for strings? This person.
Horsehair is great, but it's for the bow, not for the strings.
Right.
So you can't exactly tell, but this bow is strung. Let me see if I do this and loosen it. Yeah. Okay. So you see, there's a bunch of little tiny pieces of horsehair here. And the neat thing about horsehair, which you can't see unless you use a microscope, is that horsehair, when you look closely, is not smooth. It's a little bit. Did you ever have that pasta called, I think it's stracciatella, which is full of little kind of edges and stuff. Horsehair is like that too. It has uh, kind of hair filaments that separate from the horsehair, and you can put rosin onto them. And that rosin, that they catch the rosin and hold it, and so they control how you bow. And that rosin helps the hair pull on the string to make the string move. And those of you who have tried to bow something without putting rosin on your bow will find out nothing can happen because you really need the rosin on the bow to make this hair catch the string and make the string move. So that's how the horsehair is involved. Um, I believe there are some non-Western instruments that are horsehair fiddles that do have strings that are made out of horsehair that's very tightly, wound around each other and twisted and stuff like that. Not in Western instruments. They go with gut or with gut wound with silver or copper or aluminum if you can't afford it because gut strings are really expensive. But something
Okay.
else.
Well, that's it for questions.
Okay. Well, I
Uh,
wanted to. What?
Now we got a new one. Over history, what has rosin been made out of?
Well, rosin is really tree resin. You can, I think there's a way of making non-allergic rosin for people who are allergic to tree resin, but I don't know what it is. Sorry. So what I use is, and what as far as I know, everybody uses is tree resin, which it's like when you get maple syrup and the maple syrup flows and then you catch it and nothing. Well, when tree resin flows during the spring, people catch it in a bucket and then they harden it. Don't know how they do that. Does anybody know how they do that? So what you get, actually I have a piece of it right here, is tree resin, which is made into cakes. And you can tell it because if you scratch it with something, it will come off in little flakes. So
Another question. As a musician, how hard or easy is it to master the techniques to play 3 or 4 or 6 different stringed instruments?
hey, you guys, we're old. We got plenty of time. I mean, when I first started playing, what happened was I would be in New York and I'd be in a group and they would say, okay, this next concert, Tina, you're going to play these three instruments. And two of them I'd never played before. So a lot of times there weren't people to teach those instruments. And I would go home and I would kind of talk to the instrument and say, what do you need me to do? And the instrument would say, don't press so hard. Make sure your bow is straight. I'm best if you tune me this way, stuff like that. So I would have a personal dialogue with the instrument. And I still remember my first concert in Alice Tully Hall. There was a potted palm on stage, and I was really ready to barf into it. I was terrified. And the afternoon before the concert, I went to a friend's house, and she lived nearby, and I practiced picking up an instrument, playing two sounds on it, putting it down, picking up the next instrument, playing two sounds on it, putting it down, just so I could do the transition. But it took me 10 years before I could play in tune that way. But I had the 10 years and there was nobody else in my job. So I learned how to play in tune by playing a bunch of instruments sequentially. And in Renaissance music concerts at the time, you always changed instrument. You had four recorders doing this, and then you had the viol on this piece, and then you had the violin on that piece. So, because that's how they got variety, was to have different instruments at different times. So it's one of the things you learn. People who play in modern, in orchestra, who have conservatory training, they play one instrument really well, and I play 8 instruments, not bad. So it's a trade-off. And these days I'm playing a lot of fiddle, a lot of modern fiddle, but I'm playing English country dance and contra. To do that, I have to improvise a lot. And so I've been teaching classes on improvisation so I can get people interested in improvisation too, which is a big part of early music. So, something else?
No, I think that's it for now.
Okay, keep those cards and letters coming. Um, anyway, so I was trained really well. I was really lucky. I was in Cleveland. Anybody else from Cleveland? I am from Cleveland. And Cleveland for some reason had an excellent bunch of musicians there. I mean, the orchestra was great, but also the teaching faculty of not only the professional school, which was the Cleveland Institute, but the School for Little Kids, the Cleveland Music School Settlement. First-rate teachers. I don't know if you've heard of Nadia Boulanger, but she was big in the French musical scene in the 1920s. Well, she taught my theory teacher and my composition teacher. So they studied with Nadia Boulanger. My modern dance teacher, she performed with Martha Graham. So we had some great teachers there. And so I was in the same music theory Saturday class with the same four kids for 10 years with this one teacher who had been studying with Nadia Boulanger. And by the time I got to Oberlin, I passed out of 3 years of theory because we had learned basically everything really, really well. Well, that was very lucky because it gave me a whole background for going out and reaching and doing all these different musical styles. So by the time Hesperus was 5 or 10 years old, we did British colonial music and Spanish colonial music and medieval and Renaissance and Baroque and our own version of medieval and Appalachian fusion. And we did all that, Scott and I, and we studied different styles of playing so we didn't disgrace ourselves or disrespect any other style of music. But the thing that I began to like to do the most and have continued since Scott died is to play music for silent films. And it's not necessarily what you'd expect, but what happened was there was a guy named Rob Farr who was at Arlington. He was worked for the part of the Arlington government that records programs. So if you go to something sponsored by Arlington County, there will probably be somebody recording it for Arlington County, and he was one of those guys. And he came up to me after a Hesperus performance, because Hesperus was an ensemble in residence in Arlington County for about 10 years. And he said to me, "Have you ever thought of playing for films?" And I said, no, actually, we're kind of busy now, and I don't think we could do that very well anyway. And he said, "Watch this." And he gave me a copy of the 1920 film Robin Hood with Douglas Fairbanks. And I don't know if you know Douglas Fairbanks, but he was just wonderfully athletic. He'd jump on, he'd fight, and he'd this and that. And I mean, very exciting silent film. And you never notice that there's nobody talking because he was just so full of energy and vigor and stuff. And we saw that and we thought, wow, this is very musical. What he's doing is very rhythmic. And you know what I found out later? A lot of people who acted in those films, they had a piano going while they acted to help them act rhythmically. So how do you tell that something's rhythmic? Well, you look at them and they're walking chunk, 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 like that, for example. Or they're going, "Hello, how are you?" "I'm fine, thank you." And you realize that that's 1, 2, 1, 2. It lends itself very much to music. And as for deciding what music to use, well, you might say to me, but didn't silent films have music already? Well, they did have music already, but the music that they had for the opening of the silent films, right? The in the big Chinese, right, the Grauman Theater and that cost a lot of money. It cost a lot of money to rent. It cost a lot of money to have all the people to play that music in your little movie theater in Podunk, Iowa, right? So what people mostly did was they forgot about that script, that film, that soundtrack. And they basically either had a keyboard player or a keyboard and fiddle or a keyboard and drums, and they would either play light classics or there was music that people would hand out. It was really interesting. It was film music, and they would say, "Okay, this is Indian music. Bum, 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 ba da da." So it would sound like somebody's idea of Indians. Or this is romance music, and there would be love theme. Or this is marching, and there would be a march, that you could use and then improvise over. And improvise is the word that people used to play silent film scores by looking at the film, using the little rubrics which the film company gave to you, saying, "Here, this is going to happen, so you'll want this kind of music," and just watching and playing along. So I thought, well, we can do that too. And then I thought, hey, if it's going to be Robin Hood, why don't we use music from Renaissance Europe? I mean, that's supposedly when Robin Hood is. I found out later Robin Hood is actually medieval, but bear with me here. Because they thought that he was Renaissance. Now, was there a real Robin Hood? Nah, there was no real Robin Hood. Robin Hood was a amalgam of people. There was a guy named Robert Hood, and there was another guy named Robert of somebody who was a thief along the North Road that ran from England to Scotland. But there was no one person that was Robin Hood. A bunch of legends kind of collected around these people and coalesced into the idea, especially about the time of Henry VIII. He loved Robin Hood. So the idea of a noble outlaw who robbed from the rich and gave to the poor, yeah, all made up. Still, it was a great idea. And on their honeymoon, Douglas Fairbanks' wife, who was, remember who that was? It was,
Mary,
sorry?
Mary Pickford.
Mary Pickford, yeah. Mary Pickford said, I was reading this serial about Robin Hood and said, hey, you know, honey, you could do that. Because Douglas Fairbanks was really tired of drawing room comedies and he was looking for some type of action flicks. So what happened was he and his guys wrote a script. They ended up with some wonderful things. My favorite being at one point, Robin Hood slides down the curtain. And there was a slide, an actual kid slide underneath the curtain. He slid down the slide, and it was a two-story room and stuff. So they had many things to make him happy and show off. And we put music to that, and it was Renaissance music. Some of it was English, and some of it was just kind of generic Renaissance music. Well, that was the first one. And then we thought, hey, how about Zorro? Ah, even better. Zorro was Spanish colonial. We had Spanish colonial music and we had Spanish Renaissance music too. And we've got a little time here, and I'm going to show you our first version of what we did with Zorro. And what I wanted to tell you is that this is me playing violin and viola da gamba, and my friend Grant playing lute. And we're improvising over what they call a repeating bass. This repeating bass over and over, it's kind of like heart and soul. But that was a thing in the Renaissance. People would improvise over those repeating basses, make a lot of wonderful things happen. So here I am sharing the screen, and I'm sharing some more. And hi there. And this is my really frightening backdrop. Okay. Here's the mark of Zorro. Hello? Yes. And what you've got here is the first scene where Zorro appears. And watch how the music interfaces with the action, okay? Which is all just from seeing it. And how do I make this bigger? I know. Everybody hear that okay? Tell me if you're not. Notice we're getting faster. supervise. Yeah. So, thank you. So, that's what we did with that film. Whoops. Uh-oh. And now it's starting again. Okay.
So we're about 5 minutes.
Yes, yes. And as soon as I figure out how to get a hold of it and stop it. Hold on. Okay. There we are. And now I can leave because for some, I can't leave. There. Okay, now where are you? I can't find you. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can see you and hear you just fine.
I wonder why I can't see you. Ah, there we are. Okay. So, I just wanted to say that since that time, which was 2004, we have made DVDs out of 7 of these silent films with different types of accompaniment and have about 12 in repertoire. We've kind of been slowing down for the pandemic. We used to do them in town a lot, at the AFI and at the Arlington Cinema and Draft House. And now we're starting to perform them again, but our first one is we're doing 3 in Boston around July 4th. So that's what I do. I'm also in a Sephardic group called Trio Sephardi, which is located in Arlington, and you might want to come hear us. We're kind of good. And I play for dances at Glen Echo. And so I think I'm 73, and I think that a number of us have retired, but I'm not too sure what that word means.
I have
So
a question. Have you ever played at the Spoleto USA Festival?
I have we played in Spoleto. We did colonial music in Spoleto, British colonial, which was wonderful. Actually, they had some beautiful old venues. And so we played about a week of concerts there. That was fun. And uh, let's see, we also swam a lot. As I remember, they put the performers out in the island, which was a lot of fun. One way or another, I've played in most of the venues in town, in all of the halls at Kennedy Center and outdoors. Uh, Georgetown, AFI Silver Theater, um, and then of course the Folger. A lot of stuff. We got married in the Folger too, which was nice. But as a performer, you spend your time doing a lot of different things, and you teach as well. I've been teaching for the pandemic. Um, and it's really nice to get to know the people in the neighborhood. The last neighborhood thing I did was there was a little party in the park along the canal. I mean, the towpath. Do you remember that? It was a few weekends ago. And we used to be in residence of the firehouse, the Arlington Firehouse, and do kids programs there. So I hope to see you sometimes, and I promise I'll do some more concerts off my porch. And oh, by the way, I did want to point out another thing that's happening in town, in Arlington, which maybe is not really our provenance, but we're all connected with that. Is that the Saturday is a yard sale, right? A community yard sale. So if you end up stopping by my booth, which is at North 17th and Nelson, I will have a bunch of CDs and DVDs if you're interested. I Hesperus made I think maybe about 12 CDs, and then I have 7 DVDs of these silent film things. So
Okay, we have a couple of questions here. What is your outlook for early music going forward? Are there more people and students interested than when you started?
interesting that you should mention that right now. After I leave you, I am driving up to Boston to go to the Boston Early Music Festival, which was an international celebration of early music with student groups and professional groups from all over the world who come and play early music for these 11 days, I think 10, 11 days in June every other year. So, as far as I can tell, it's going pretty good. Yeah.
Okay. Have you previewed the newly updated Folger Library music spaces?
I haven't. I took a kind of a virtual tour, but I wasn't too clear on what ended up what. I quit the Folger about 20 years ago, and there's a new director of public programs who wants to integrate Renaissance music in the modern community by having them do collaborations between the Folger concert and local artists, which makes the Folger concert guys very uncomfortable. So I'm really curious in a certain Schadenfreude way to see what happens with them. We did not part on good terms. And I'm not going to tell you anything about that. Yeah.
Next question is, how do we find your schedule? This person
Oh,
says they don't see a complete schedule on your website.
no, gee, a website. Okay, I promise I will update that website. It's obviously time to do it now that it's after the pandemic and we can have schedules again. Okay, so that is the place to keep looking. I'll do it. I'll be good.
Okay, and are you familiar with the excuse me, with the singing group called Anonymous?
Anonymous Four, they're called, and they're not organized anymore. But yeah, you bet. These were four women who were also instrumentalists, who were great people, and they had this weird idea of just early music singing group, and they made a recording in January, and the recording wasn't going to come out until the next November. And we saw them about April, and they were saying, well, we don't think anything's going to come of this. The record company's kind of weird. And then, of course, they struck it big, and for 20 years, they also traveled the world and were very, very well known. So, yeah, they good stuff. And now that they're not Anonymous Four anymore, each of them is performing what they want to do. One person's still in a medieval group, somebody else is doing English, country and western, which I thought was kind of interesting, and somebody else is playing with their grandkids, and it's but yeah, if you hear any Anonymous Four recordings, very interesting stuff.
Well, Tina, we're ready to wrap up here, and I have one comment that Gary didn't read that one of our group has put in here that I'm going to sum up this incredible session today by saying Dr. Chancey is a world-class professional musician who is very smart and very talented. That's how she's able to play so many medieval and Renaissance music so incredibly well. We're lucky to have her speaking live with us today. And I think that sums up how we feel about this. This was so surprising and inspirational.
Sorry. Yeah.
You are exactly the person I hope we all want to be when we grow up. And part of that is because you really aren't growing up, are you?
Nah, not a chance.
Great. Well, thank you so much for being with us today. And